What you are looking at right now is something called a candlestick. Every coal mine built during this era required ventilation, and the candlestick, a tall chimney rising above the surface, was the standard solution. On its own, seeing one of these structures means very little. They were common, expected, unremarkable. But this particular candlestick and the mine directly below it are a different matter entirely. Rather than marking the endpoint of a mine that stops safely short of open water, this chimney sits at the entrance to something far more extraordinary. Stretching out from this point was a tunnel known as the Main Road, a passage that extended 6 full miles beneath the floor of the Irish Sea. 6 miles underwater, underground, with a single way in and a single way out. It is almost difficult to accept that something like this was built at all, but it was built. And what happened inside it was, in some ways, more terrible than if the tunnel had simply flooded. This is the story of the Wellington Pit Disaster. As always, viewer discretion is advised. When this channel first began covering mining disasters, and particularly the story of the Levant mine, which many of you will remember as the disaster that unfolded beneath the ocean itself, one of the most striking things about that story was the simple fact that the mine existed at all. The idea that men were digging tunnels under open bodies of water seemed almost implausible, not because it couldn't be done in theory, but because of when it was being done. These were not modern construction projects with precision engineering and computer modelling. These were men working by the lights of gas lanterns, digging by hand and by pickaxe, pushing tunnels out beneath the ocean floor 1 foot at a time. And yet the instinct that this must have been rare turns out to be completely wrong. Undersea mines were not unusual at all. At one point in history, there were dozens of active mining operations running beneath bodies of water in England alone. They were a practical response to a practical problem. Coal seams do not stop at the shoreline, and the industry followed them wherever they led. What that means, if you sit with it for a moment, is that for people born into mining towns during the 19th and early 20th centuries, descending into a candlelit passage under the ocean was simply what you did for work. Your father had done it, his father before him had done it, and when you were old enough, you would do it too. One of those towns was Whitehaven, located on the western coastline of England. In 1910, Whitehaven was a community built entirely around coal. The industry had driven its growth and its economy for generations, and it continued to do so into the new century. Coal mining was not simply an occupation in Whitehaven, it was the occupation, the foundation on which almost everything else in the town rested. Everyone in Whitehaven knew someone who worked the Wellington coal mine, also referred to locally as the Wellington Pit. The mine employed both adult men and teenage boys, as the labour protections that would eventually restrict child employment had not yet been established in the way they later would be. The Wellington Pit was a large and complex operation. Its main underground passage, the Main Road, ran for 6 miles out beneath the Irish Sea. Branching off from this central corridor at various intervals were additional tunnels, driven perpendicular to the main passage to extract coal from the seams running alongside it. These side tunnels connected to 3 separate working areas that had been designated as Districts 3, 5 and 6. The Main Road was the only route connecting all of this to the surface. Every man who went into the Wellington Pit entered through it, and every man who came out used it as well. There was no secondary exit, no alternative shaft, no backup route. Mining engineers of the period were already aware that this was not ideal. By the early 1900s, professional guidance recommended that mines of this scale should have multiple exit points to provide redundancy in an emergency. The Wellington Pit did not have them. A decision driven by cost, practicality, or some combination of both, and the people responsible for operating it understood the risk that created. The mine's ventilation system gave some sense of the scale involved. A single fan, 24 feet in diameter, and spinning at 126 revolutions per minute, was required just to push fresh air down the length of the main road. The deepest sections of the mine sat close to 1,000 feet below the surface, and with the full network of horizontal tunnels extending in multiple directions, the total volume of underground space that needed to be ventilated was enormous. On any given day, 723 workers were employed across 3 shifts, running around the clock. The pit never fully stopped. On the evening of May 11th, 1910, the overnight shift had just begun. Somewhere between 7:30 and 8 o'clock that evening, men working deep inside the Wellington Pit heard something that did not belong. The underground environment of a working coal mine is not quiet. Drills run continuously, pickaxes strike the walls. Men call out to each other over the noise of machinery and rock. The sound of a mine in full operation fills every tunnel from floor to ceiling. What the men heard that evening was different. It came from somewhere distant and unidentifiable, and it resembled nothing so much as a low rumble of thunder, except there was no storm and no reason for thunder to reach them 6 miles beneath the seabed. In District 5 North, a miner named Joe Kenmore was working alongside 2 colleagues when the sound reached them. All 3 stopped immediately. Something about it, the depth of it, and the direction it seemed to come from, told them without explanation that something was wrong. They moved out to the main road and looked down the tunnel. In the distance, a cloud of dust was visible, hanging in the air and drifting toward them. Joe and the others tried to approach it from a couple of different directions, but the dust made it impossible to assess conditions safely. Then the heat reached them, then the smell of smoke. Elsewhere in the same district, a separate group of 24 men was working under the supervision of a miner named Jack Ware. Jack had not noticed anything unusual until his teenage son, who was working alongside him, shouted about the noise. Jack gathered his crew and led them toward the main road, where it met the boundary between Districts 5 and 6. When they arrived, they found Joe and his 2 companions already waiting there. The spot where the 2 groups met turned out to be a reasonable place to hold. Air flowing out of District 6 kept the immediate area relatively clean, and the men stood together and waited, hoping for some kind of instruction or information from elsewhere in the mine. After a period of waiting without any word coming through, Jack made a decision. He announced that he was going to attempt to get out, and that anyone who wanted to follow him was welcome to try. Of the group gathered there, only one person volunteered, Joe Kenmore. The 2 men tore strips from whatever cloth they had available, pressed them over their mouths and noses, and walked into the smoke. Jack's son stayed behind with the others. As the smoke inside the tunnel was so dense that their lanterns became useless almost immediately. The light simply could not penetrate it. They dropped to their hands and knees and crawled along the floor of the tunnel, because the smoke and fire had risen toward the ceiling, and the air was marginally cleaner at ground level. It was grueling work. The heat was severe. At several points along the route, sections of the tunnel roof had collapsed, and the 2 men had to force their way through the debris. Roughly an hour after entering the smoke, Joe and Jack emerged from the mine entrance and collapsed on the ground outside. Their lungs were badly damaged from the smoke they had inhaled during the crawl, but they were alive. And as they looked around at the faces outside the pits, they realized something stunning, and they were the only miners who had made it out. Joe and Jack reported what they had seen on the way out: fire blocking the main road, smoke filling the tunnels, and no indication that anyone else had been moving in their direction. The mine manager put together a search party and sent them in. The group pushed down the main road as conditions allowed. The tunnel grew hotter and smokier as they advanced. When they had closed to within roughly 80 yards of the fire itself, the intensity of the heat forced them back. From what they could see before retreating, the fire had completely sealed the passage. The only way in or out of the mine was blocked. Word of the fire spread through Whitehaven quickly. Families of the men on the overnight shift began arriving at the pit, and they kept coming. By the time night had fully fallen, the two roads leading toward the coastline were backed up with people moving towards the Wellington Pit on foot and in vehicles. By the early hours of May 12th, thousands of people were gathered outside the entrance, standing in the dark, waiting. When morning came, the number of miners confirmed to have made it out overnight stood at 7. Rescue efforts continued through the morning. The best information available suggested that the majority of the trapped men were located more than 3 miles from the main shaft, deep in the mine, far beyond the fire. Smoke had by this point spread throughout much of the tunnel system and was visible above ground, producing a trail in the sky that stretched for roughly a mile. Each rescue group that entered the pit was pushed back before it could reach the fire. The heat, smoke, and carbon monoxide levels in the tunnels made it impossible to advance far enough to do anything useful. Some of the men attempting rescues tried wrapping themselves in brattice cloth, a fire-resistant sheeting material typically used to protect coal from flames, but the cloth absorbed so much heat so quickly that they could not hold onto it long enough to continue. At around 4 in the afternoon, Britain's Chief Inspector of Mines, J.B. Atkinson, arrived at the Wellington Pit. He was accompanied by H.A. Abbott, the Inspector of Mines for the North East District. The two men entered the mine themselves to make a direct assessment of what was happening inside. What they found was enough to form a conclusion. The fire and the gases it was producing had spread further than earlier reports had indicated. The heat, even well behind the fire line, was at a level that made sustained movement through the tunnels without protection effectively impossible. When JB and HA came back out, they made a decision. All rescue personnel were to be withdrawn from the mine immediately. The reaction from the crowd of miners and family members gathered outside was immediate and fierce. Some of those present had to be physically restrained by others to prevent them from pushing past the officials and entering the pit themselves. But JB had been inside. He had felt the conditions firsthand. In his professional judgment, there was no person alive who could reach the trapped men and survive the attempt. That evening at 9 o'clock, Wellington Pit officials met with the inspectors to formally discuss how to proceed. But despite JB's conclusion that the men inside were almost certainly dead, a compromise was reached. A specialised rescue team based in Elswick, located just under 100 miles away, would be contacted and brought in. They carried equipment that no one on site had access to. The Elswick team arrived shortly before 11 that night. Their equipment included enclosed breathing helmets, devices that looked similar to deep-sea diving helmets, connected to supplies of clean air that could sustain a person inside the mine for approximately 1 hour. With this equipment, they could go further than any previous group had managed. At just before 11:30, the team descended into the pit, along with the inspectors, mine officials, and a small number of additional miners brought along in case physical assistance was needed. The walk to the area near the fire took well over an hour. When conditions became too difficult to breathe without protection, the specialized team stopped and fitted their helmets. The rest of the group fell back to safer ground and waited. The team pushed on for another 170 yards before being stopped. Visibility was effectively zero. The smoke was so complete that moving forward risked walking directly into the fire without any warning. The temperature was extreme, even at the point where they had halted. One of the team members tripped over telegraph wires that had fallen from the tunnel wall and made brief contact with them through his clothing. The short exposure was enough to leave severe burn marks on his legs. Before turning back, the team reached a section where brattice cloth was still hanging from the ceiling. One of the men extended his bare hand past the cloth to test what the air felt like on the other side. He pulled it back immediately. He told the others it was like pushing his hand into an open oven. Inside each of their helmets was a small identification nameplate, a precaution in case any of them did not make it out. The heat inside the mine was intense enough that parts of these nameplates melted during the attempt, dripping onto the faces of the men wearing the helmets and leaving them with severe burn blisters. There was nothing more that could be done. The team turned around, rejoined the others, and all of them made their way back to the surface. The crowd outside had learned of the Elswick team's arrival hours earlier, and it had given many of them the first real sense of hope they had felt since the fire was reported. Watching that same team emerge from the mine without the men they had gone in to find erased it completely. 136 men and boys were believed to be dead inside the mine, and the crowd gathered outside struggled to accept that there was nothing left to do. At some point in the night that followed, J.B. Atkinson made the decision he had been building toward since he first entered the mine. His experience had already told him the previous day that survival inside the pit was not possible. Everything the Elswick team had encountered confirmed it, but the order he was about to give still carried a weight that he acknowledged openly. Extinguishing a mine fire requires removing the oxygen that feeds it. The only way to do that in the tunnel system is to construct a sealed brick wall across the passage, cutting off the air supply to the section where the fire is burning. It is a standard and well understood procedure in mining emergencies. It is also when there is any remaining uncertainty about whether men might still be alive on the other side, one of the hardest orders a person in JB's position can give. Even knowing what he knew, even having felt the conditions inside the mine on his own skin, ordering the wall to be built meant accepting officially and permanently that the 136 men were gone. He gave the order. The response from the broader mining community was not quiet. The following morning, roughly 3,000 miners from towns and cities throughout the surrounding region gathered in the centre of Whitehaven. They had come with the intention of forcing the authorities to restart rescue operations by whatever means that required. When the group arrived at the pit entrance, they met a police presence blocking access. Some of those in the crowd attempted to climb over walls to reach the mine. The confrontation was tense, but ultimately no one entered the pit, and the situation was brought under control without further escalation. JB agreed to meet with 3 representatives from the group. In the meeting that followed, those 3 men argued with urgency and emotion for the rescue effort to be resumed. JB listened and then laid out, in direct terms, what he had observed and what it meant. The men inside the mine were dead. Sending additional people in to do anything other than build the wall would not save anyone. It would only add to the number of casualties. The 3 representatives left the meeting and returned to the crowd to relay what had been said. As they did, an unexpected tension emerged. The family members who had been standing vigil outside the pit throughout the night reacted with hostility toward the newly arrived miners, not out of anger towards them personally, but because the disruption felt like a violation of the quiet grief they had been holding on to. The presence of the larger group had broken something that the families had been maintaining through the long hours of waiting. Construction of the ceiling wall began and continued through into Saturday. The men working on it, miners themselves, many of them with friends or relatives among those trapped, worked steadily and in near silence. More than one of them later described having to remind himself repeatedly as he laid each course of bricks that the men on the other side were already gone. On Sunday morning, before the final section of the wall was completed, a group of mine managers entered the pit one last time using their own breathing equipment. They wanted to get as close as possible to the suspected location of the fire's origin before the passage was permanently sealed. They had not gone halfway to their target before conditions forced their helmets on. Pressing further, the canary one of the managers was carrying in a small cage fell from its perch inside the cage and went still. The use of canaries as indicators of dangerous gas levels in mines was a well-established practice by this period. Because of their faster breathing rate, birds are affected by carbon monoxide and other toxic gases significantly earlier than humans are. A canary that lost consciousness was a reliable signal that conditions had reached a level requiring immediate evacuation. The phrase that later passed into common usage, the canary in the coal mine, originated from exactly this practice. Even with their helmets providing clean air, the managers could not continue much further. The heat intensified rapidly as they advanced. A series of partial roof collapses had left debris across the tunnel floor, and the scale of what they were moving through made it increasingly clear that the fire had been burning at an extraordinary intensity. Based on what the managers observed on that final inspection, they recommended that 2 additional ceiling walls be constructed elsewhere in the tunnel system. The collapses appeared to have created openings to lower levels, which could have been supplying additional oxygen to the fire from below. Those walls were built as well. When the last brick of the last wall was in place, the workers left the mine and the Wellington Pit was closed. Smoke continued to pour from the ventilation intake above ground for months afterward. The dark column rising from the shaft was visible from across Whitehaven, and for the families of the men still inside, it served as a daily and unavoidable reminder of what the mine contained. When the smoke finally stopped and mine officials were confident the fire had been fully extinguished, workers returned to the Wellington Pit and began tearing down the walls. What followed was one of the most harrowing recovery operations in British mining history. As the teams moved into the sections that had been sealed off, the extent of the fire became apparent. The conditions that had existed on the other side of those walls had been incompatible with survival, with the inspectors and mine managers who had turned back at the limits of their equipment had made the right call. There had been no possibility of reaching those men. At the same time, the evidence inside the sealed sections made something else clear. The 136 men had not died immediately when the fire began. They had been alive for some period of time, hours at minimum, before the smoke overwhelmed them, or the fire reached them directly. That knowledge made what was found inside harder to process. The youngest person killed in the disaster was a 15-year-old lamp carrier named Robert Garraway. A 44-year-old miner named Thomas McAllister was recovered in an embrace with his 17-year-old son James. The two had died holding on to each other. 5 other members of the McAllister family also perished in the same disaster, very nearly wiping out an entire family line. One of the miners had removed all of his clothing before he died. His garments were found folded neatly in a pile beside him. Others had used chalk to write messages on the steel pit doors. Words left behind in the hours before the end, with no way to send them anywhere. The bodies were brought out one by one and laid in a line at the mine entrance. Family members were brought forward to view them and make identifications. The process was prolonged, deeply traumatic, and conducted under conditions that offered very little in the way of dignity for anyone involved. In total, the Wellington Pit Disaster left 85 women without husbands and 260 children without fathers. The recovery process carried one final, painful complication. As the last body was brought to the surface, the team expected to be able to identify him easily. 135 of the other victims had already been confirmed, leaving only one person unaccounted for. But when the identification was attempted, it became clear that a mistake had been made somewhere in the process. The last man recovered was not who he was expected to be. By that point, the other 135 had already been buried. The error meant that at least one of the men who died in the Wellington pits was interred under the wrong name, in the wrong grave. To this day, that has never been corrected. A subsequent investigation into the cause of the disaster determined that a buildup of methane gas had ignited inside the mine. Methane is produced naturally as a byproduct of coal extraction and accumulates in underground spaces where ventilation is insufficient to clear it. In high enough concentrations, it requires only a small ignition source to combust with devastating force. The most likely source of that ignition, investigators concluded, was a safety lamp that had been damaged at some point before the explosion. In recognition of the rescue efforts carried out during and after the disaster, the King Edward Medal for bravery in industrial accidents was awarded to 64 individuals who had participated in the attempts to reach the trapped men. It remains the largest number of these medals ever awarded following a single incident. The Wellington Pit Disaster stands as one of the deadliest mining accidents in the history of England. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you for watching Creepy Real Stories. If you have a story you think belongs on this channel, use the submission form linked in the description below. Like and subscribe if you want more real stories like this one. I will see you in the next one.